Thank you so much for waiting for so long. Well, apologies for getting this a little late than expected. Alright, moving on to the next session. This session is all about history and fiction. Blurring the lines, historians Gyan Prakash and Zarir Masani discuss whether the integrity of each gets compromised. Now, let's welcome on stage. Before that, let me give an introduction to Mr. Gyan Prakash. He is the Dayton Stockton Professor of History at Princeton University and is the author of several books. His publications include the widely acclaimed Mumbai Fables, which forms the basis of script he wrote for Bombay Velvet, a film currently under production under the direction of Anurag Kashyap. Ladies and gentlemen, give a big round of applause for Mr. Gyan Prakash. Moving on to the next person on stage, Zarir Masani. Give a big round of applause. Zarir Masani has an Oxford history doctorate and is the author of several historical books on India, including widely acclaimed biography of Indira Gandhi, India Tales of the Raj and India from Raj to Rajiv. He spent 2 decades as a current affairs producer for the BBC and is now a freelance journalist and historian. His most recent books, Macaulay, pioneer of India's modernization, explores the controversial legacies of British India's most influential policymaker. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an hour of conversation with the historians. Let's begin this right now. Here we go. Sir, the stage is all yours for an hour. Thank you so much.
Okay, you can hear me, right? I insisted that I wanted this Madonna kind of microphone before I performed. So, just to get things going, what I thought I would do is utter a few thoughts about the distinction between history and fiction, and then Zarir can take it from there. And just thinking about this topic, it occurred to me that the distinction between history and fiction is an old Aristotelian one. And Aristotle in his Poetics, writes about the difference between what he calls historically actual and literally possible. And his idea was that there is a very sharp separation between historically actual, that historians write things that happened, and that in fiction or romance that he was writing about, in romance you make things up. And the idea was that historians don't make things up. They write about things that happened, and that there is a sharp separation. But over the years, as historians and fiction writers have thought about the topic, they've kind of loosened the sharp kind of separation between the two. And the idea is that what could happen, what typically happens, what might happen, and what actually happens are complex, overlapping positions in a spectrum. And that given that kind of overlap, it's hard to make a very sharp distinction between history and fiction. And one way in which one can think of a kind of a common enterprise between history and fiction is that both tell stories. That historians also, their narrative is a species of the genus story. They are telling stories. And that when you tell a really compelling story, when you arrange events into a narrative, it's then that we believe that we have a truth of the past. And that's why many times, novels, when you read, if there's really compelling narrative in it, you think it is like history. For example, many of my students, when they read Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, even though it is written in this kind of magical realist style, they think that it is actually a history of India from 1947 to the emergency. Or when they read Muhammad Hanif's The Case of Exploding Mangoes, they think it is an actual story of the assassination of General Zia. And I think that's a kind of a tribute to the way novelists have situated their narrative in a historical period and use history in order to tell the narrative. So, I don't know Zarir's experience about this, but when you wrote Macaulay, you must have also been thinking about how to tell the form of the story that you would adopt.
I'm going to move simply because I can't see you in the audience at the same time. So no other reason. I would come at this. I would agree with some of what Gyan has said, but I think I would want to make some distinction between writing historical fiction and writing history, because I agree they are both stories, they both require a certain kind of narrative. It's interesting that history has gone through different phases. There was a time when history was considered an art. So it required imagination, it required narrative skills. It then went through, I think, a rather dry period of being treated as a social science, especially in post-colonial studies and so on, where it all became very structuralist and very kind of, you totally ignored people's lives or narratives, but in favor of a kind of very analytical, thematic approach. That has now been replaced by a return to narrative history, so we see various examples of it. Sort of people like Simon Schama on the French Revolution, and so forth. And so narrative history is very much back in fashion. But I would say that the difference is, I wouldn't go as far as Aristotle, but I would say that I don't think historians should be in the business of inventing stories that don't have a factual basis, or at least in factual terms are possible. You can have certain facts and imagine something that emerges out of them, but I think the factual basis has to be there. And I wouldn't accept Midnight's Children as a historical work in that sense. I think it is a novel. It is an exercise of the imagination. Now, coming to my own case, the books, you asked about Macaulay, but I suppose a better example would be the book I wrote before that, which was a family memoir, which wasn't mentioned in the introduction, but it's called And All Is Said, and it's called And All Is Said, Memoir of a Home Divided. And it's about my own rather turbulent childhood and my parents' very passionate love marriage across a communal divide and a very acrimonious divorce, etc. It's available outside if you want it. That was, in a sense, a work of non-fiction, because it was a memoir. On the other hand, I didn't apply the same disciplines to it that I did to my biography of Macaulay, which had to be very carefully sourced and referenced for everything I quoted. There are extensive footnotes, etc. With the memoir, I was relying on memory and to some extent imagination, imagining what people's emotions might have been. So I think there are different genres of historical writing, if you like, and some are closer to fiction, and some, I think, are very distinct. I wouldn't want to read, a very good friend of mine has just written a best-selling book on the causes of World War I, Margaret Macmillan. There's no way that I would have wanted her to write a book that was inventing stories, and there was enough evidence, not to need to do that. So that's my thing.
Well, it would be a kind of a sacrilege to say that historians make things up or they invent. But there is a sense in which they do. Let me take an example. So when I was writing Mumbai Fables, and one of the chapters in the book has to do with the Nanavati, famous Nanavati case in Bombay in the late 50s and early 60s. Now, if you take the facts of the case, they're pretty straightforward. And the facts are, here is Commander Nanavati, who works in the Indian Navy, is married to an English woman, Sylvia. Sylvia has an affair with this Sindhi playboy called Prema Huja. Commander Nanavati finds out about it. He goes to Prem Ahuja's apartment in Malabar Hill, pumps 3 bullets into him. Trial happens. The jury acquits him. The judge overrules the jury. By the way, that's the last jury trial in India. And then he's convicted by the High Court. He appeals to the Supreme Court. His conviction is confirmed. He goes to jail. 2 years later, he's pardoned by the governor and he goes to Canada. Now, if I just recited these facts and created a timeline, it wouldn't be a story. And so now the Nanavati case created a kind of a sensation in Bombay of the late 50s and early 60s. Now, if I wanted to find out how is it that this case tells me something about Bombay of that time, or what is the kind of story that both the defendants and the prosecution told? Because after all, in a trial, what you have is the prosecution tells a story, a credible story, and tries to convince the jury that that's what happened. And the defense tells an alternative story. And here the defense's alternative story was, here was Commander Nanavati defending the nation. Meanwhile, this ultra-modern, playboy, immoral Prem Ahuja was undermining his family. And there were all these stories about, Prem Ahuja was cooing into women's ears and saying, the meaning of my name, Prem, is love. Now, but it was a compelling story and the jury bought it. Okay, so they created their own story, and so when I tried to kind of construct what actually happened, there were stories that these people were telling, and it was invented, and I had to tell that story and put it in relation to what was going on in Bombay. So, those facts were then arranged into a narrative that, I could say I made up.
But I would argue that all historians do that.
Yeah.
I mean, history is not just about compiling facts, it's about selecting facts. So all historians, however scientific they claim to be, and all scientists, are selecting data and interpreting, creating hypotheses out of data they select. They don't just present you with all the raw material, and if they do, it becomes very unreadable and unwieldy, as certain historical terms are. But I would argue with the Nanavati case, and I'm old enough, unlike you, Gyan, to have been aware of it in the 50s, because I was born in 47. So I remember, there were 2 very sharply opposed views, and I was probably, my parents, my father Parsi, my mother Hindu, were both very much on the side of poor Prem Ahuja, who got shot, unlike a lot of people who sympathized with Nanavati, because there was a lot of evidence that he had plenty of warning of this affair, that it was a fairly calculated murder, and that he was protected from quite high up by Nehru and Krishna Menon, whose blue-eyed boy he was. So that element was there, that controversy, and there were 2, as you say, very sharply differing accounts. But I suppose what a historian would do, and I'm sure what you did, and I apologize for not having read your account of it, is that you presented both views, and then you may have given your own opinion, which is fine. But you wouldn't have invented a whole, scenario that no one had actually presented you with.
No. I mean, I didn't go up sort of inventing, let's say, events, but just arranging events in a way that it kind of told a story. I mean, it's interesting that, when the news came out that Anurag Kashyap was making the book into a film, many of the journalists wrote in the newspaper, Mumbai Fables, a semi-fictional account of Bombay. Now, if you told my department chair it is semi-fictional, he'll probably fire me. And maybe the journalists, wrote this without having read the book. But if I wanted to be more generous to them, I would say maybe they were paying a compliment that it was it was telling a story, and therefore it seemed semi-fictional or real. But when I actually thought about it, and I thought about the process or the difference between the book and the film, which is fictional, I thought of there's a way in which historians are envious of novelists, because novelists are able to invent the kind of inner life of their protagonists. And E.M. Forster actually said once that in history we write about the public accounts or the public actions of individuals, and to the extent we can gauge something of their spiritual experience from their actions. Whereas the novelist is able to, and his or her realm is the realm of passion and the realm of dreams and the realm of nightmares which they can sort of invent. But the historian, since we work with public record, we don't really have that. And that distinction must remain. And I think, as a historian, you work with public archives and public record, and that's what you have, and you do as best as you can with it.
But having said that, and having made that distinction, I must say that when I think of certain authors of historical fiction, historical novels, who distinctly have said they are writing fictional novels, they can end up doing far more actual historical research than a lot of